the letter to the Galatians is one of Paul's very strongest statements of the importance of Christ over the law. The letter to the Galatians is very important historically because you can see what happens on Paul's missions. He goes to cities proclaiming the gospel. Gentiles become followers of the religion. Paul, after spending time, will leave. And who comes in his wake? But Jewish Christian missionaries who say this man is an impostor and what he teaches is false. He teaches you an easy way because you want the easy way. But the easy way will lead you to damnation. To follow Christ is to obey the law, to obey the Torah, to obey the Mosaic law. Paul was not a real disciple. And if you follow him, you risk your soul. Paul's letter to the Galatians is written back to the churches in Galatia to respond to these types of adversaries. And it is for this reason that Paul's letter to the Galatians is the most autobiographical, because in it Paul must say who he is in response to these accusations that he's an impostor. Galatians you can think of as a forerunner to his greatest letter, to the letter to the Romans. Right? So you can read Galatians and Romans together. They're his most theological letters. The letter to the Romans is his magnum opus, his greatest work. But the Galatians is like a first draft. You can see the ideas that will be worked into an even higher level of expression in Romans. Paul begins to think of a particular Christian notion of freedom in Christ. Freedom from the law. And what it means to be saved and to have the freedom that is allowed by the death of Jesus. And in thinking about this idea, which comes out of the arguments over, do Gentiles have to follow the law? How can a Gentile be saved? What does it mean to say that the Messiah saves people? The Jewish Messiah saves people, but they don't have to follow the law of Moses? Raises these questions that are deeply theological. And as Paul thinks about it, notice the way that he uses the figure of Abraham. This figure that would have been familiar to all Jews, who is central to the idea of the covenant, to the identity of the Jews, who is in some sense the ancestor, the father of Judaism, and becomes central in Paul's interpretation, his understanding of Jesus. Maybe the most famous story about Abraham is that God asks Abraham to obey him, even as he asks him to do something extraordinary, to sacrifice his own son, Isaac, on an altar. And you may know this story. At the last minute, he doesn't really have to, but he was willing to obey. So extensively did he trust, so completely did he trust God. Now the Christians, especially Paul, see this as a prefiguration of Christianity. They see this as a premonition of Christianity. They see in this God communicating to humanity. For Abraham was willing to sacrifice his son, but didn't have to. God, too, was willing to sacrifice his own son, Jesus, and in fact did. So you see how this is a rich figural story. It's a metaphor for Christianity, Paul says. But he says, think what else? Abraham trusted God. He had faith, which means trust, pistis. And Paul says, this figure, the father of the Jews, when did he live? He lived hundreds of years before Moses. Did he have the law of Moses? No. And was he righteous? Yes. Why was he righteous? Because he trusted God. How can the law of Moses, in the grand scheme, be the essence of righteousness? How can it be the only way to salvation? Abraham didn't have the law of Moses, and he was accounted righteous because of his trust in God. And so you see Paul using this allegory as a theological metaphor. Paul says that those who follow Christ, those who are baptized into his death, participate in the sacrifice of Christ and can become righteous apart from the law.